In the center of Armenia's capital stands a monument erected in honor of Yerevan's chief architect, Alexander Temanyan. It is carved out of one of many chunks of grey basalt that form the base of Yerevan. A verse from a poem of Temanyan's great contemporary Yerevan, who only survived the grand architect by 1 year, is featured on the stone. Probably he has imagined the sun-filled city. There it seems as though the two Armenian words, Yerevi, probably, and Arevain, sunny, encrypt a third one, Yerevan, the ancient name of our sun-filled city, as if seen in a dream by its creator. Monuments honoring architects are rare in this world, just about as rare as cities built from one architect's blueprints. Those in Rome will credit Bramante. Londoners will recall Christopher Wren, Parisians are proud of Haussmann and Mansart, and those in St. Petersburg remember Trezzini and Quarenghi. Alexander Temanyan belongs to this constellation of grand architects. However, since his birth and through the first 40 years of his life, Temanyan was known to the world as Tamanov, named in line with the long-standing tradition of transliterating Armenian names à la Russe, customary in the Russian Empire. Temanyan was born in Yekaterinodar in 1878 to the family of a Nakhichevan teacher Hovannes Migranovich, also known as Ivan Mironovich Tamanov, and Maria Emanuilovna Popova, born as Terterian. Historians will note that 2 years later, in the same region of New Nakhichevan, or present-day city of Rostov-Don, another famous Armenian by the name of Martyros Saryan was born, whom Temanyan would meet and befriend many years later in Yerevan. But at that moment, the world of the future architect was only beginning in his parents' home, and it appears that nothing can be farther from the very meaning of the word architecture than this lime-painted hut. We have no idea how this talent initially made itself known, or what event made him an architect. In the childhood of another genius, Ivan Ivazovsky, then living nearby in Crimean Feodosia, there was a legend about the whitewashed wall that he drew on with charcoal, and a kind local mayor who chanced to notice the childish drawings. However, there are no such stories about Sasha Tamanov. There is only evidence that 2 years before the end of the 20th century, a 19-year-old Alexander Tamanov was enrolled as a student in the architectural sector of the Imperial Academy of the Arts in St. Petersburg. The next 17 years of study and work propelled the humble Armenian youth to a position of the chief royal architect of the Russian Empire that over the years belonged to renowned master architects such as Fioravanti, Trezzini, Quarenghi, Rastrelli and Rossi. His first designs were a tribute to heavy Russian Baroque and its successor, the Imperial style, like the renovated Armenian church on Nevsky Prospect and a home of Counts Abameli Glazarev in St. Petersburg. As his gift developed further, Temanyan worked on Count Kochubey's mansion in Tsarskoye Selo, then on Count Sherbatov's home in Moscow. The latter was honored by a golden medal from Mayor of Moscow as the most beautiful building of 1913. On October 27, 1914, Alexander Tamanov, at the age of 36, was elected to the Petrograd Imperial Academy of Art for fame in the field of arts, as recorded in his honorary diploma. The memorial rooms of Peter the Great, of Empresses Elizabeth and Yekaterina II, Tsars Alexander I and Nikolai I in Tsarskoye Selo were decorated and furnished from his drawings and under his supervision. For the 30th year anniversary of the Romanov dynasty's rule over Russia, a huge celebration was held, and in this honor the Emperor Nicholas II traveled on the Volga River, for which a national exhibition of culture, fine arts, industry and crafts was built in Yaroslavl. This project was planned and accomplished by Alexander Tamanov. The remaining sketches and photographs of this man-made wonder give us a glimpse of a truly magical, fairy tale-like town, the kind one might read about in Russian fairy tales. A little model of the Russia's history, its idealistic and non-existent utopia. And all this was brought into being by a foreigner from the pragmatic cinematographers instantly recognized the magic of the Tamanyan style. Thus, his enchanting town in Yaroslavl was used as a decoration for the first Russian historical film Stenka Razin, and a pre-revolutionary version of Anna Karenina was shot in the Count Sherbatov's home. Generally speaking, the second or Armenian part of Tamanyan's heroic and unbelievable biography often overshadows the first, Russian part of it. But only a combination of these two parts, like the two wings of a bird, could create the phenomenal artistic rise to which his Armenian compatriots owe their capital city. It is impossible to completely understand and value this unusual person without knowing that in the beginning of the 20th century, Alexander Tamanyan was one of the characters of a legendary Silver Age, the last wave of majestic Russian culture that emerged in those 14 years in the true elite and bohemian circles and in the shiny literary art magazines of those years, Apollo, Vesi and Mir Iskustv. Tamanyan lived and worked among such masters as the ingenious poet Alexander Blok. Tamanyan created theatrical decoration for Blok's play The Rose and the Crows. The brilliant theatrical director Stanislavski, who staged the production of The Rose and the Crows, famous painters Bakst, Dobuzhinsky, Lanseret, Benoit, and writer Fyodor Sologub. In the January of 1917, following endorsement of Great Countess Maria, President of the Imperial Academy of the Arts, Alexander Tamanov, then Academic of Architecture, was named the overseer of fine art artifacts of imperial palaces, parks, palace buildings and theaters of the Russian Empire, in charge of protection of the art treasures of the royal family. This was the highest architectural position in Russia. Alas, Tamanov stayed in that capacity only a few days. The country was swept into turmoil by the February Revolution of 1917. Poets and artists met the fall of the empire with enthusiasm and hope for the freedom and growth of the arts. Already in March, a meeting of over 1,500 Russian arts activists took place in Petrograd. The meeting was directed by Vladimir Nabokov, the father of the future famous writer. Among those present were composer Glazunov, singer Shalyapin, balletmeister Fokin, artists Repin and Benoit, writer Gorky, and architect Shusev. Alexander Tamanov was elected to be chairman of the Provisionary Committee of the All-Russian Union of Artists. On April 29, 1917, the provisional government issued a decree appointing Academician of Architecture Tamanov to supervise the former department of the court, essentially as vice-chairman of the Academy of Arts. On the same very day, Tamanyan issued an appeal to the Petrograd Council of Workers and Soldiers, asking to save the monument of Yekaterina II and the Vorontsov Palace in Odessa. In May, he was busy trying to save the art collections of the Hermitage. In June, he instantly appealed to the Prime Minister of the Provisional Government to pass a law that would ensure government protection of art and historical memorials, as well as preventing their smuggling and trafficking across Russian borders. What may be a history to us has been a chain of mundane events to the contemporaries. Here is a seemingly impossible and even amusing fact. Just a day after the Bolshevik revolt, Alexander Tamanyan's addressed board meeting of the All-Russian Union of Artisans, where he didn't speak of the historical role of the Great Socialist Revolution. Instead, he denounced the destruction of the Winter Palace and the looting of furniture and artwork by the revolutionary soldiers and workers. Tamanyan demanded immediate protection for these national treasures. Alas, dear comrade Tamanyan obviously failed to grasp the grand scale of the ongoing reconstruction of the world. It was pure luck that none of the gun-bearing revolutionary comrades bothered to clarify the seriousness of his grave delusions. In June of 1918, in his final public address in the capacity of chairman of Russia's Artists' Union, he stated that the most important issue is that of relations with the establishment. We would like the government to abstain from any attempt to govern the arts and to listen carefully to the recommendations generated by the artistic community. This paragraph was, at the very least, naive. It was spoken during dangerous times, when Bolsheviks instituted the Red Terror policy, and such liberal rhetoric was soon to be deemed sufficient to have one arrested and later moved over to executions by firing squads. In January 1919, Tamanyan resolved to leave Russia. However, Tamanyan's departure turned out to be a reunion, a repatriation rather than an emigration. For the first time, he came to Armenia by a special invite of the government of the First Armenian Republic and not of the Soviet power, as it was reported later. His repatriation turned out to be an exit from the dead end of his prior life and the whole prior world of his, of everything he cared for and believed in too, along with the millions of others. Most likely, Armenia was his clean slate, the torture yet the temptation of every genuine artist. The reality was a greater wonder, not the bitter reality of the country shattered by the genocide and the war, but its royal past, the silent glory of the ages hidden in crumbling fortresses and temples. As an exalted student, Tamanyan learned the ancient architecture of his native land, glorious and tough as the surrounding mountains. Along with his colleague and friend Torosto Romanyan, he traveled to Ani, at that time located still within the borders of Armenia. In June of 1920, he described his new credo in a letter to the government of the First Armenian Republic. Those ancient historical monuments spread over the territory of our historical motherland are a product of Armenian spirit and mind, a living proof of ancient culture of our country, a supreme value of our nation, a never-drying source of renewed creativity for all generations of our people. During his first year back at his homeland, he created his most famous and widespread design, which to this day can easily be found in varying amounts in the pockets of our compatriots. Very few are aware of his authorship of this design, since this is not the opera house or the government house. Those are yet to be created in the country's next historical period, during the time of the Soviets. Meanwhile, in 1920, Tamanyan was commissioned by the government of the First Armenian Republic to design its Great Seal. His design was scorned and banned by the Bolsheviks, only to be resurrected 70 years later by the Third Republic of Armenia as its current state symbol, signed on Armenian national currency. Back in 1920, after fall of the First Republic and Soviet takeover, Tamanyan destroyed all the copies of the seal in his home and studio to avoid possible repressions from the Bolsheviks. Yet the Bolsheviks were yet to come, and in the remaining months and weeks of 1920, Alexander Tamanyan launched the design and construction of state buildings in the capital city of Yerevan. On June 19, 1920, as the chairman of the Engineering Society of Armenia, he co-designed the Batum-Kars-Alagias Railroad. In his letter to the First Republic's government, he specifically notes not only purely engineering superiority, but also political and economic benefits of this project. The railroad cuts through Armenian territory to the Black Sea. Thus, it is exclusively Armenian road, not dependent on the neighboring countries, and linking Armenia to the outer world, slashing down the Yerevan Black Sea passage length by 50%. The road in planning brings another huge benefit, as it becomes one of the major elements of the future Trans-Persian Railroad, reducing its overall length by 330 miles. As we know, this project was way ahead of its time, because even today we have failed to secure the solution to the problem he discovered almost a century ago. In October of 1920, the chief architect of the Armenian Republic, Alexander Tamanyan, petitioned the government of Armenia, asking to institute a national committee tasked with protection ancient artifacts and to send archaeological expeditions to start excavations in Armenian provinces. Alas, just a few days later, his destiny took yet another dramatic turn, along with millions of his compatriots. In November of 1920, the Bolshevik army invaded Armenia. Tamanyan stayed for a while, hoping that changes would be peaceful. In 1921, after the unsuccessful uprising against Bolsheviks, the latter initiated large-scale repressions and arrests. At this point, Tamanyan, the designer of the national seal, the former royal architect of Russian Empire, the former deputy commissar of the Provisional Government of Russia, and the former chief architect of the formerly independent Armenia, had to escape by fleeing to Iran. I sorely regret that I failed to realize my dream of building new Yerevan, a new garden city unlike any other city of Europe or of the whole world. While Colonel Garagin Nezhde was directing the heroic defense of the southern border of Armenia against both Turks and Bolsheviks in Zangezur, Tamanyan applied his engineering skills to construct a temporary bridge over Arax River, a bridge for thousands of the refugees to cross, saving hundreds of human lives. For the third time, he had to start from ground zero, from a clean slate, reinventing from scratches all his life and his destiny. First time around, he came from provincial south to conquer the snobbish St. Petersburg. The second time was after the February Revolution and until October 1917, when his illusions were crushed by hard reality. And finally, it was repatriation to Armenia, all through the late 1920, when he had to leave everything behind and run again. This is enough to compose not one but several biographies. Yet the major work of his life was yet to come. The new leaders of the Soviet Armenia were sufficiently wise to recognize the importance of culture, science and arts for the process of state building. They were building not banks, brothels and casinos, but schools, factories and libraries. Using the petty funds at hand, they were luring Armenian poets, artists, doctors and engineers from all over the world to repatriate. One of the first masters that leaders of Soviet Armenia tried to secure was academician Alexander Tamanyan, who immigrated with his family to Iranian city of Tabriz. His repatriation was a complicated special operation supported by the top government officials. There are some indirect hints that Marietta Shahinian, a prominent Soviet author, acted as an important intermediary in these negotiations. After a year of formal negotiations and pleas to come back, in February 1922, in a letter sent from Tabriz to Yerevan to the chairman of People Commissar's Council of Armenia, Sergei Lukashin Serapionian, Tamanyan said the following: "I can only live when I work. When the work stops, my existence has to stop too. My projects in Tabriz don't bring me professional satisfaction, since they don't relate to my desire to serve my people. I will do my best to find a way to return, since I would much rather prefer to work in Armenia on a condition that I can provide for my family. I can no longer endanger the health of my children. Your letter from January the 4th found me in great sorrow. My elderly daughter, 13 years old, died recently. It has been 2 months now, yet this loss was so unexpected and so badly shocked me that I cannot recover." This letter touches upon the three main themes of Tamanyan's life: work, homeland, and family. The first two themes are well explored. His private, inner world is less known, yet it exhibited itself powerfully through his creations. As delicately as possible, striving not to pry into privacy of this amazing family, we will try to understand and tell about the love story of Alexander Tamanyan, the story that leads to the secret of his creative genius. This is a real, tangible secret, not just some cliché or snazzy label. This secret has a beautiful face and a name: Camilla Edwards. Camilla Matveevna Tamanyan, a St. Petersburg beauty of British origin, was born into the family of Matthew Edwards, enrolled in Russian imperial service like many other Europeans did in the 19th century. A number of renowned Russian artists came from the Edwards family, brothers Benoit and brothers Lanceret, good friends of Tamanyan. They were going to the same school at the Academy of Arts, and he got acquainted with Camilla through them. I dare to claim that the presence of this woman explains that phenomenal rise of Tamanyan's genius, so undeniably present in everything that he created in the 15 years that he worked in Armenia. I didn't realize this until I saw on this photograph how he stares at her. This photograph was taken in 1910. Already they have been married for 2 years, yet they are still excited and delighted by each other. What could they have in common? She, a delicate European lady from a Russified Briton family, and he, a strange and humble provincial fellow. What did it take him to charm Lady Camilla? Probably his gift, his devotion, and unflinching determination had some say in this, something that Spaniards define as duende, to be roughly translated as spiritual passion. This is a wedding photograph of Camilla Edwards and Alexander Tamanyan. Back in 1908, when he married Camilla, he was just an ordinary graduate of the Architects' School of the Academy of Arts. His early works do not hint of the glory to come, nor do they promise a prosperous life. Even in 1923, when a 45-year-old, renowned and seemingly fully developed academician of architecture, Alexander Tamanyan returned to Armenia, nothing in his previous career predicted the masterpieces that he would create there. After building classical facades and interior designs in Petersburg and Moscow, here in Armenia, he suddenly creates a new architectural style, the Tamanyan style, an enlightening spiritual architecture for mundane utility buildings. This amazing phenomenon is attributed to various factors like his patriotic upsurge, his rediscovery of ancient Armenian architecture, and monumental scope of the creative challenge he faced. Yet there must be one more factor that probably outweighs all others. One has to feel and understand Tamanyan's mood in early 20s to properly interpret what was happening to him and how it was reflected through the city that he built, the one that we live in today. It is known that as they grow older, the individual representatives of old nations acquire characteristic exterior and interior features of the nation they belong to. This is perfectly true in Tamanyan's case. Looking at this elegant student from Petersburg, one can hardly foresee the image of biblical prophet emerging in prematurely aged Alexander Tamanyan. As a young person, he was granted all possible and impossible honors and benefits of the empire. Yet he, just as millions of his contemporaries, was facing rupture in the history's fabric and his destiny, forced to start everything from ground zero. A typical Armenian when it comes to the meaning of life, devoted to family and kids, Tamanyan blamed himself for the lack of stability in their life that his darling foreign-born wife and children suddenly had to live with. One can only guess the terror of Camilla when, after the European luxury of her homeland, Britain, and the imperial shine and glory of St. Petersburg, she found herself locked up in a provincial, starving, and epidemic Yerevan of 1919. It probably felt like the reflection of Dante's hell. One has to admit that this delicate European lady valiantly struggled with the challenges and deprivation of those years. Yet even that bare survival was probably recalled as a lost paradise when, after the new escape from the marching revolution to Iran, they had to live through the nightmarish experience of tragic death of their older daughter Maria. Like biblical Jove, Tamanyan had scoped the abyss of human sorrow. He could not afford to slide into despair because he had to provide for Camilla, his other daughter Varenka, and his two sons, Georgi and Julius. The Soviet government of Armenia was keen to build a new capital of Armenia. The dear wish of the architect coincided with state necessity. On one hand, the grand architect, who was neither aware of nor had yet proven the true scope of his gift to the world, suddenly got a life chance to build an entire city. On the other hand, he suffered, feeling terribly, unforgivably guilty before his beloved Camilla for all the pain and sorrow she had to go through because of her decision to tie her life with his destiny. He could stay in Iran, where local bourgeoisie was providing a steady flow of projects, but these were petty projects falling short of his talent. He could leave for post-war Europe that was in shambles, where there would be enough rebuilding and restoration projects for the former royal architect of the Russian Empire. But he decided to return to Armenia. Was there a psychological escape from the labyrinth of debt and guilt that he found himself in back in 1922? Well, he found one, and a most unusual escape it was. Here comes into play the main circumstance of his destiny, the very thing that we named the greatest secret of Yerevan. This was his love. Unable to change his destiny and unwilling to abandon his dream, he decided to build a city that is based on his love to Camilla, a royal palace for the queen of his dreams, Camilla, a knight's castle for his lovely Lady Camilla, a garden city of Yerevan. This project was surely inspired by Camilla. Her influence is visible everywhere, starting with flying shapes of new towers and palaces, arcs and enfilades of the new apartment buildings and office houses, all the way through the revolutionary concept of garden city that was proposed recently by British architect Howard, and Tamanyan was the first architect to implement it on a huge scale in a city of Yerevan. But the hidden essence, the main secret of this enormous architectural wonder, was a man's love for a woman, the love that proved its claim to eternity and majesty through the very air and stone. Without this love, the city would be shaped and slept like hundreds of other cities in a purely economical and brutally functional manner, as would seem fit for the poor and hungry times. Without this love, why would one bother with fine details and ornaments, like an admission of love and kisses that he imprinted with great grace and passion in a tufa, granite and basalt of Yerevan squares and streets, and in his greatest creation, his pride and torture, the opera, or according to his plot, the people's house. If not these stone flowers and grapes, granite pomegranates and lions' manes, bull horns and theatrical masks carved in stone by unknown masons, those columns and walls would be inhuman, spiritless and lifeless as a stone-cold time of their construction. Camilla Edwards permeated Alexander Tamanyan's creation with her beauty and passion. Even today, her beauty still permeates this city. They can be recognized in the feminine roundness of streets, squares and boulevards, in masculine slenderness of avenues, buildings and towers, in a gentle attention to details of each and every carve in stone, each and every carved gutter. This inspired the hatred from many of Tamanyan's contemporaries and colleagues, expressed in popular form of denunciations to secret services. On December 26, 1928, a meeting of Architects and Construction Union of Armenia adopted a resolution condemning Tamanyan's construction plan of Yerevan as selfish, anarchistic, and monarchist at the same time. Street and avenue counts and spans were deemed exuberant. Parks and green zones of the town were deemed exceeding reasonable demands. The project as a whole was labeled as academic and impractical, defying the requirements of socialism. Luckily for both Tamanyan and for us, Armenian leaders ignored this provocative rhetoric and political labeling. Tamanyan was allowed to proceed with his project. He was raising Yerevan as an antique amphitheater, where homes and districts on the hill slopes, like spectators in a theater, would face the south, the scene of mountain Ararat. He blatantly stated this objective in his 1929 letter to the chairman of the People Commissars' Council of Armenia, yet his enemies would not stop. Finding no support in Yerevan, younger members of the Union of Proletarian Architects of Armenia published their next attack on Tamanyan in the March of 1930 in Tbilisi, in main communist paper of the Caucasus. Here are some excerpts from the publication. We are appealing to our press, to the party, to Soviet regional and professional organization, to institution in charge of the Cultural Revolution, and to the broad masses of the proletariat. We demand a halt in the construction of the People House, a project of academician Tamanyan. It is a product of academism and antique archaeology, one disgusting anachronism artificially transplanted into our times. In the era of the proletarian dictatorship, it is out of touch with contemporary demands, reactionary and absolutely alien in our epoch. Regarding its architecture, one has to admit that the author has meticulously and with archaeological precision recreated ancient royal palace architecture, sprucing it up with a mix of church feudal, defined by the author as national, and Hellenistic styles, mixed up with the imperial style. This people's house architecture demands unique, jewelry-precise labor known only in the labor camps of pharaohs, French kings and Romanov dynasties. This eclectic style is innate to imperialism. It is unacceptable in our era of proletarian dictatorship. This document makes for a shameful and disgusting reading. Yet it was authored and signed by the young and gifted architects, many of which were Tamanyan's students. This document was concocted in the period of repressions and arrests, when demands like this could have placed the master's life at stake. Yet he was spared once again, and once again he forgave the ill-wishers. Only God, and probably Camilla too, knew the toll that his constant persecution took on him. The enormous effort, the stress, and unending attacks of his enemies led to his rapidly progressing blindness. In 1934, a disease killed his younger daughter. In the photographs taken at that time, his face and eyes revealed the overwhelming stress he lived with. For some time he had to wear sunglasses and could not work with blueprints. That was the time when his elder son Georgi turned up in his study to take over the larger part of the low-level job, and the work went on. The building of the Yerevan Opera, the People's House, hides another secret, or to be more precise, a scary prophecy. The building remarkably resembles a mystical construct found on the very top of the Tower of Babel, on the year 1563 painting of the Netherlands artist Peter Bruegel. It is universally believed that God disapproved of the construction of the Tower of Babel and disrupted it by confusing the tongues of the tower builders. 5th century Armenian historian Moses of Horen retells the story of Assyrian author Marabas Katina, based in its turn on Greek version of ancient Chaldaic sources. The story describes the Great Flood, the story of wonderful survival of Xisutri, known in the Bible as Noah, along with his sons, that gave start to people of the modern world. Genesis of Armenians, who call themselves Hai, goes back to the 23rd century BC, when one of Noah's grand-grandsons, a grandson of Japhet and a son of Targam, a tribal chieftain, Haik, from the midst of the Tower of Babel construction, led his people away from Babylon to the country known as the land of Ararat. For some unknown reason, Bel-Nimrud, a king of Babylon, reacted to this news by charging after Haik. According to historians' account, Haik's lucky arrow slayed Bel. An enormous Babylonian army was sent away in disarray, just like the Tower of Babel falls apart in the better-known historical episode. How is this relevant to the Yerevan Opera House? At the construction site of the Great Babel Stairs to Heaven, all the subject nations had to do their chores. Some of them cut the rocks, others moved the pieces over to their proper places. And, of course, Someone had to interpret commands, accounts, appeals, verdicts, pleas, and songs. It is most likely that Haig's people were the tribe of interpreters, offspring of Targum. The very name of Targum is ingrained in Armenian language, the word for interpreter being Targmanich. When Haig ordered his interpreters off the multi-thousand, multilingual construction site, the end result could be only an instant lack of communication and resulting standstill. Interestingly enough, the Opera House of Yerevan remained unfinished as well. In the midst of the construction work, by Stalin's personal order, the project was amended to erect a huge statue of Lenin. Later, Stalin changed the location of this grand design. According to a new decision, a special super tower was to be erected in the center of Moscow, the modern Babylon. A huge palace of councils with Lenin towering on its skyscraping dome was to be built in a place of the demolished Temple of Christ in Moscow. Yet this tower was never completed like the Babylonian one. But one cannot overturn a prophecy, one can only delay the day it comes true. 50 years later, the Yerevan Opera House reclaimed the title of the New Babylon Tower. It was indeed the unfinished Babylon Tower of the late Soviet Union, where in 1988 the fall of the Soviet Empire began, when multi-million crowds came over the Opera Square to take the power. Tamanyan created two main squares in Yerevan, one in front of the House of Government and another near the Opera Theatre. These squares, like two theatrical stages, turned the city into the capital. They kept switching roles now and then, like Shakespearean kings and clowns, turning tragedy into farce and vice versa. For several decades, people used to parade across the official square, demonstrating their loyalty to the state power. Lenin's monument towered over the square to be later replaced with a cross, and then yet again with a giant TV set, apparently a symbol of the new power. There is currently a void on that place, and it is called the Republic Square. In the second square, people would gather for true, unofficial celebrations. In 1963, they have celebrated here the great victory of Tigran Petrosyan, a world chess champion. In 1988, they gathered here again to wrestle the power away from the state. At present, the square is covered with a chain of coffee shops, and it is referred to as the Freedom Square. Today, those imitating Tamanyan's style succeed only in producing shallow replicas of the form devoid of the key meaning and principles of Tamanyan's work. In Yerevan, Tamanyan built homes for the people. It's no coincidence that he named his masterpiece the People's House. Universities and libraries were for the people, as were observatories, hospitals, power plants, apartment buildings, and even the House of Government. In sharp contrast to Tamanyan's creations, the modern-day elite banks and offices of Yerevan are reminiscent of concrete safes and glass shelves, despite the decorative addition of neoclassic columns to their facades. They were built for the sole purpose of being rented out at an outrageous rate per square meter equal to annual salary of a construction worker, the very worker who built these buildings. Tamanyan died in 1936. When he was being lowered into his coffin, those present gasped. The chief architect had two large holes in the soles of his shoes. He had worn them thin during the construction of the People's House. It was soon discovered that this was his only pair, and so he had to be buried in his eldest son's track shoes after removing the spikes from the shoes' soles. The pallbearers carried his coffin from his home to the construction site of the opera and placed it on the ground. At that moment in time, the walls of the opera building rose only a meter from the ground. The construction of the opera theatre, just like many other projects of Alexander Ivanovich, was completed by his older son, Georgi Tamanyan. He inherited his father's architectural genius. From his mother, Georgi inherited his British looks and chivalry, as well as another typically British trait, a strong athletic drive. Georgi owned a bike and motorcycle that were probably some of the first to appear in Armenia. Camilla survived Alexander Ivanovich by 30 years. In each generation of the Tamanyan's family, one of the girls was always named Camilla. In this photograph from the 60s, Camilla Matveevna is surrounded by her daughters-in-law and her granddaughters. Camilla Jr. is in the left bottom corner. The one to her right is Gayane. Isn't it remarkable the extent to which she has inherited her British grandmother's beauty? Alexander Tamanyan's fate was both tough and glorious. Like a biblical prophet, he saw the triumph and the fall of governments and kings. In the course of his life, Tamanyan saw recognition and fame, lived through the tragedy of losing daughters to death, and experienced betrayal of his disciples. His life spans wars, revolutions, and genocide. He took on the enormous task of designing and executing the resurrection of his motherland from its ashes. The holy trinity of his short but amazing life were his job, his motherland, and his family. Luckily for him, all the three survived him, and so the great architect is blessed with eternal life through his buildings, his Yerevan, and his passionate love.